So my name is Matt Rooney. I am a research fellow in Energy Environment Unit at Policy Exchange, and today we're going to discuss issues brought up in our recent publication, Driving Down Emissions, How to Clean Up Road Transport. But before I get to that, I'll just cover a few housekeeping issues. We'd like to thank Anglo American for the support for this event. We'd also like to thank the Labour Party for having us. And of course, we'd like to thank our fantastic events team for running 3 events today. And we have 3 more events tomorrow. And there's a leaflet on your seat if you'd like to find out what Policy Exchange are doing at the conference. I think there's McDonald just arrived. Just so you all know, the event is being live streamed. And it will go up on, probably go up on. Yes. The event is being live streamed on the Policy Exchange Facebook page, and we'll probably put the video up on our website after the event. So my predecessor, the ex-head of Energy Environment at Policy Exchange, was Richard Howard, and about a year ago he conceived this idea for a report called How to Clean Up Road Transport. Now, Richard had previously done a lot of good work on air quality and how to clean up London's air, and it's when I thought about my opening remarks for today's event, I thought it's so nice to be in Brighton because the air is so wonderful here. But when I got out of the train station, I thought, well, that's not actually the case. There are towns and cities across the country where we are exceeding the NOx emissions limits for the EU and in England. And that is largely, in the UK, that is largely a problem due to diesel vehicles and older diesel vehicles. And moving away from diesel is one of the first things we'll have to do. But then there are lots of options that come up. And it's, with air quality, with cleaning up transport, it's not just air quality, it's about CO2 emissions as well. And the two are intrinsically linked, but we don't think that was accurately represented in government attempts to clean up transport. So if you get rid of the diesels, you can get some easy wins. You go from diesel to petrol or diesel to natural gas, and that gets rid of your NOx emissions largely. But you still get large CO2 emissions if you do that. Then you can go to hydrogen or electric vehicles, and you largely clean up both air quality and CO2 emissions. But some people would say, well, we actually want to get people out of their cars and onto bicycles and public transport and things like this. And so that is another strategy, but I think the government needs to take a range of these strategies going forward. So I'd like to bring in our speakers now. I'm going to give each highlight. Is that right?
Sorry.
So we're delighted now to have both major transport representatives from the Labour Party. Andy McDonald, MP, Secretary of State, or Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, and Lilian Greenwood, who's chair of the Transport Select Committee in Parliament. And I'd like to give Andy 5 minutes to make an opening statement.
Okay.
5 minutes, if you wouldn't mind, and what the government should be doing to clean up road transport. I'll give you a 1 minute signal.
Oh, you give me 1 minute? So it's that. Okay, I'll try to crack on. Well, first, thanks, Matt, and thanks for Policy Exchange for hosting the event, inviting me. The challenge posed in today's event, how to clean up road transport, is one of the most urgent and significant facing this government, and indeed every government the world over. There are no objectives more important than protecting the planet and improving people's health and well-being, which is why improving air quality and decarbonising our economy will be the primary objectives of the next Labour government. And Labour promises to create a fair and more prosperous society. Those promises are interlinked with cleaning up our transport system. And at the general election, Labour's manifesto outlined a vision of how to transform our society into a more just, equal and prosperous one, and cleaning up our transport system is key to it. As you remarked, Matt, poor air quality is linked to 40,000 premature deaths per year in the UK alone. I mean, with air pollution causing asthma in otherwise healthy children, stunting children's lung growth, and it's linked with strokes, heart disease, and diabetes in older people. And if you had 40,000 deaths caused by other means, it would be recognised more urgently as a public health crisis. We know that air quality is linked to inequality too, and poor quality is an obstacle to creating a more prosperous country, with the cost of healthcare and lost business. Some 6 million work days a year estimated to cost the economy 28 billion. So these are the sorts of figures, 28 billion pounds a year. And yet, despite the social and economic costs of poor air quality and being repeatedly dragged through the courts, the government are not rising to meet this challenge. And the government have attempted to pass the buck to local authorities and have refused to accept the need for clean air zones, despite them being the best tool we have to improve air quality in affected areas in the short term. Labour would introduce charging clean air zones in areas of illegal air quality, but it's important that it's done in a fair manner, meaning that only the most emitting petrol and diesel cars will be charged along with lorries and trucks, but striking the balance between putting in place the correct incentives and discouraging worsening air quality is key, not only for the success of the initiatives to clean up road transport, but to ensure that such plans can enjoy political support that will allow a government to implement them. And this must mean providing alternatives for those who might have driven but are discouraged from doing so by charging clean air zones. So vibrant public transport systems are the lifeblood of thriving towns and cities and are key for improving air quality. And Labour's policies to improve local transport, keeping the cost of rail down and improving services through public ownership and expanding the rail network, re-regulating bus services across the country to boost patronage, increasing funding for cycling and walking to get people out of the car and afoot onto a bike, and integrating public transport and ticketing. That's going to provide environmentally preferable alternatives that are going to better support our economic development than the transport network we currently have. And I believe that to efficiently clean up road transport in a way that's fair, a diesel scrappage scheme will be needed to assist the transition to low emission vehicles. And those who bought diesel cars in good faith shouldn't be penalised for acting in accordance with the scientific advice at that time. And a diesel scrappage scheme, if it's designed carefully, is going to play an important role in cleaning up road transport. However, to avoid a waste of public money, it's important that any scheme is targeted as much as possible, ensuring we can most effectively target those vehicles who are the most active in contributing to poor air quality. And Labour is examining how any scheme could help support the transition to ultra-low emission vehicles, including electric vehicles and hybrids, rather than simply a shift to cleaner petrol or diesel cars. And for this to be effective, there must be a significant public investment and new legislation brought forward to remove the barriers to uptake, such as increasing the availability of charging points and delivering greater interoperability. I mean, it's quite ridiculous that the industry's come up with several methods of making that connection. And we should also emphasise that whilst we're cleaning up the road transport, it is a costly exercise for governments. There are also significant opportunities, particularly for the UK manufacturers who are poised to take advantage of the transformation of road transport. And this is why Labour are committed to taking advantage of cleaning up road transport through improved local transport and a transition to lower emitting vehicles as part of an industrial strategy. Because at the end of the day, clean air is a birthright and not a privilege. And I look very much to listening to what you have to say and engaging in this conversation on a longer term basis. But thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Andy. Very comprehensive overview there, and we're glad to see that Labour are advocating, as you say, a targeted scrappage scheme as we advocate in the report. It's very easy for a scrappage scheme to become a middle class subsidy for rich people to buy new vehicles, which may not be much cleaner. So I'd like to move maybe into the private sector before I come to Lilian. I'll go to Mike Copson and Shell. And Shell are a huge player in the transport world, as we know, and cover everything. Your particular interest right now is hydrogen, but maybe you would like to talk about that and expanded on how Shell will deal with the transition to clean transport.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, so I'm from Shell New Energies. I work in the hydrogen sector, but I've got an overview of the whole business. So I've got 3 key messages, and I'll be very clear when those key messages are coming out to make it nice and straightforward for everybody. And also as well, I'll try and be less than 5 minutes because I want to open the debate up rather than just talk at you. So moving people and goods is vital for economic prosperity, but how that is done and how efficiently is really a critical part of the global energy transition that's underway. Now, we know that transport accounts for more than 1/4 of the world's total energy usage and 1/5 of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. And that means that the transport sector has a fundamental role to play in helping global effort to reduce emissions. Now, there's actually 3 emissions that we need to reduce. One of them is air quality, the other one is carbon dioxide, and the third one is noise. So those are the 3 that really need addressing. And air quality and CO2 can sometimes be split up, sometimes they need to be done together, and as well as noise as well. So here's the first key message. So during the transition to a low carbon future, different fuels have to coexist. So it's not about chasing silver bullets, and it's not about picking winners. They're all going to coexist together. So examples of that, if you look at the drivetrain of any vehicle, some are suitable for some applications and some are not. So if you look at urban mobility, then e-mobility is actually a good solution there, but for long distance haulage, batteries just simply aren't an option at the moment. So with that in mind, Shell's developing a suite of new fuel solutions. The first one is around biofuels, and we have a joint venture called Ryson, which is with a Brazilian company called Copson, and that's the world's largest producer of sugarcane ethanol. Now, from crop to wheel, this can reduce CO2 emissions by around 70%, so that's a good, clean, easy win for first-generation biofuels. In Germany, we're working with the government and 5 companies to accelerate hydrogen fuel cells, and I will come on to that a little bit later on. We've also got liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas options for light-duty and heavy-duty gas fuel options. Shell GTL Fuel is a cleaner diesel that's made from natural gas, and that's a low investment option to address air quality right now, and that could reduce NOx and PM by 25% in existing fleets today. Finally, we've got e-mobility, and some people might say that e-mobility is counterintuitive for a company like Shell, but as an energy company, Shell will be introducing electric vehicle rapid charging across 10 of our UK stations by the end of the year. Our teams are currently in the process of installing and testing these charge options, and we're very excited to be announcing our vehicle charging offer later this year. Now, these are all exciting bits that are outside of our core business, but how do we implement them all? And this is the second key message. It's about 3 words: collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. We need collaboration with academics and commercial partners to make these things possible. But most importantly, there has to be collaboration with government. Stable, forward-looking and transparent policy frameworks are absolutely critical to get the others to invest in the transition. A good example is the joint venture in Germany called H2 Mobility Germany. That's 6 companies: Shell, Air Liquide, Daimler, Linde, OMV and Total. And together we're putting together a nationwide grid of hydrogen refueling sites, so 50 at the moment, hopefully 100 next year, and 400 by 2023, to demonstrate what hydrogen mobility can look like for the German market. But at the same time, Toyota and Honda already have fuel cell vehicles in the market, and Daimler, last couple of weeks, launched the GLC fuel cell vehicle at the Frankfurt Motor Show. So when you look at the chicken and egg around which comes first, the car or the pump, it's actually both simultaneously, and this is why the collaboration piece is really, really important. Shell's also a founding member of the Hydrogen Council. This is a combined force of 13 energy, transport and industrial companies with hydrogen investment plans totaling 10.7 billion over the next 5 years. And earlier this year, Shell opened its first hydrogen retail site at Copson, just off the M25, with our friends at ITM. And we're also committed to opening 2 more, hopefully by the end of this year. So what's the third key message? The third key message is We've got to forge the partnership and venture out into new areas. Ultimately, it's about achieving the greatest efficiencies possible with the fuels and vehicles that are available today while preparing for tomorrow. This means adopting a balanced portfolio approach rooted in reality. And at that, I'm going to shut up and let the rest say something.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'll plug our report again. We did also recommend that hydrogen in the beginning can make a big contribution to heavy goods vehicles, and you could roll out a strategic network of hydrogen stations around the country as a way of kickstarting a hydrogen economy. I'd like to move back to the political world, Lilian Greenwood, who's the new chair of the Transport Select Committee. And Lilian, if you'd like to take us through some of what you think the policy challenges of moving to a cleaner transport system.
Thanks very much, and really glad to be here at this policy exchange discussion about air quality being one of the biggest challenges that we face in the country, and rightly having a higher profile than it has for some time. The government sadly behind the curve in terms of actually taking strong action to deal with air quality, and even with the latest air quality strategy, I think they've shown a woeful lack of leadership. Everyone knows that this is a difficult political issue. It does mean us doing things differently, and it almost feels to me that the government have gone, this is too difficult, here go local authorities, you deal with it, you deal with all those difficult political decisions. So I think the first thing that we need is better leadership across the piece about what is the challenge that we face. Andy set it out in terms of some of those health issues, some of the choices that it lays out. But we can't expect local authorities to be able to do that. It takes strong political leadership right down, and actually to prompt a public discussion about what sort of places we want to live in, what these health challenges are, and how we collectively are going to respond to them, rather than it becoming a blame game or be characterised as a war on the motorist or all these familiar things that we've all seen. The second thing that I think we need is that we've got to have vehicle emissions tests that people can trust. There's no doubt in all the discussion around air quality that the scandal around VW has undermined people's trust in what they think, what they're buying when they buy a motor vehicle, and whether they can even trust what the government is telling them in terms of the policy choices that they're going to make. So many people who bought diesel vehicles thought they were doing the right thing, and now they find that they're part of the problem. So I think sorting that out and people having clear information and transparent information is going to be really important. Now, one of the issues in the discussion around air quality is almost an attempt to pretend that the private car is not part of the problem. There's no doubt, particularly in increasingly congested roads, that the issues around emissions are worse for large vehicles, whether it's buses or HGVs. And it's quite right that we tackle emissions from buses and HGVs, and we can do that in a variety of ways. Some of the contributions that have just been talked about in terms of fuels. But we can't completely ignore private cars, and I think we need to be honest about that. And we need to talk about the ways in which we can tackle that fairly, so that it doesn't disproportionately hit those who are least able to cope with changes, whether it's in terms of charging or whether it's in terms of encouraging and enabling people to change their vehicle, because obviously those who are better off are more likely to be buying a new vehicle sometime soon, and those people who really rely on their vehicle but perhaps got an older and dirtier car, how do we make sure that it's that they're able to be part of this? And of course it is people who live in inner cities, predominantly those who are less well off, who are worst affected by some of the air quality issues that we face. And that's part of the thing that I think as a Labour Party that we should be doing, is making sure that we're aware of that issue and that we're on top of it. So I said about the need to tackle congestion, which makes emissions so much worse. And I think that does at least mean we need to start having a conversation about demand management. In London, we've already seen that happen with some long time ago now in terms of congestion charging. It does require some political bravery to make decisions around congestion charging, as we've had in London, or the workplace parking levy, as we've had in Nottingham, and I know a number of other cities are looking at the possibilities of demand management measures. And I think it is about that balance between carrot and stick. In London, we already started to see a massive investment in buses before we saw the introduction of congestion charge. So people could see, and of course that money from congestion charging or other measures, if it goes into improving public transport, people can rapidly see that, they can understand the bigger picture, and they can say, well, if you're making the public transport as good as it can be, I can sometimes choose to make that choice. But it isn't about we shouldn't present it as a binary choice. It doesn't mean everybody giving up their car. It does mean changing the way that we travel for some of our journeys. And I think one of the really worrying things in terms of statistics is about the way in which so many short journeys are undertaken by car, when we could be making short journeys, particularly using by walking or by cycling, and we've got to make it easier for people to make those choices. But yes, it does mean sometimes changing how we do things. I don't think it's just about passengers. Obviously, freight has got a really important part of this. Andy mentioned a car scrappage scheme, which I think is part of the answer, but it isn't the whole answer in terms of how do we get best bang for our buck. One of the things we might do is about looking at retrofitting buses, which is relatively cheap, and we'll get a large reduction in emissions from doing that. And public transport is clearly, a modal shift is clearly going to be an important part of the answer. And finally, of course, we need joined up thinking across government. We know that in time people hopefully will have the confidence to be able to move to, for example, electric vehicles, but they're only going to be able to do that if we've got the charging infrastructure, and we're only going to be able to have that sort of charging infrastructure if we're having the discussion around energy, whether it's generation or distribution. And obviously I know we've got a colleague from National Grid here too. So I think we need to make sure that those connections are being made across the piece in government, that we're making the connections between health and transport, and between energy policy and transport. I'm really looking forward to the rest of our discussion and to hearing what the audience have got to contribute as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Lilian, for bringing up something that I should have brought up in my opening remarks, which is one of the most important aspects of air quality, is that we've been measuring the emissions from vehicles wrongly for years and years and years. The tests they've been using for the Euro standards are flawed, and one of the most important things is to move to better standards so that consumers know how polluting their cars are, both from a NOx emissions point of view and from a CO2 point of view. I'm sorry, there's two Marcuses on the end and I've been ignoring them both. I'd like to go to Marcus Newborough from ITM Power first, and I'll let National Grid have the final word. Marcus.
Hi, ITM Power manufacture hydrogen refueling stations based on the splitting of water into hydrogen for refueling fuel cell vehicles. I think it's important to root your understanding in the fundamentals, and if you look back about 20 years, there was a research pathway agreed, which was essentially to move vehicles from engines to hybrids, where electric motors took over some of the traction, and then to battery vehicles, and then to fuel cell vehicles. So there were a series of stepping stones that took you down that route. It took 20 plus years to get there, and here we are today with fuel cell vehicles as the end step in that route. When we talk about EVs, I think we often forget the detail below EVs. Okay, so there's two types. One is the battery electric vehicle, the other is the fuel cell electric vehicle. Current government is not being inclusive when it talks about EVs of these two types of vehicle. It's important to be inclusive and to be technology neutral amongst the EV category. Sure, the electric motor is really efficient compared with an engine, but there's a choice there as to whether you put the energy into a battery or into hydrogen to fuel the fuel cell to drive the vehicle forward. Key attributes of the fuel cell vehicle are that you can refuel it in 3 minutes. And since the dawn of motoring, we've usually only stopped for 2 or 3 minutes to fill up with fuel. Okay, so this is normal behavior for a lot of businesses. It's not disruptive. Versus charging of battery electric vehicle, which can take up to several hours. The second key aspect of a fuel cell vehicle is the fact it has a similar range to a petrol or diesel vehicle. You can travel long distance, whereas a battery electric vehicle you cannot travel as long distance. So for those reasons alone, it's important to be inclusive when you talk about EVs of both battery electric and fuel cell electric. I think the next aspect to it is obviously the fuel cell vehicle needs hydrogen. Where do you get that from? All right, now we have an awful lot of renewable energy in the UK where we've got a fantastic solar, wind, tidal resource to harness in the coming years. We have a vast amount of offshore energy in the form of wind power. The key question is how much of that should come ashore as electricity and how much could be coming ashore as hydrogen. In other words, we need more than electricity, and successive governments have been over-focused on electricity only. We need to broaden that to be linked between electricity and transport and heat. So the key aspect for fuel cell vehicles is, can you make the hydrogen in a green way? Yes, you can. We're deploying several what we call electrolyser-based hydrogen refueling stations in the UK, which operate on green electricity and therefore make green hydrogen. So not only are you taking away all the NOx and the CO2, all the particulates, you're delivering a completely green solution. So it's a step change for people adopting fuel cell vehicles. The clock is ticking. 2050 feels like a long way away. It's actually not very far away, and therefore we need to look for step changes. And those two key steps are stepping to battery electric vehicles and stepping to fuel cell electric vehicles, but thinking very carefully about how we make the hydrogen for fuel cell electric vehicles. Clearly there's a catch-22 there. We already have an electricity grid for recharging battery electric vehicles. We do not have a hydrogen infrastructure. It's just beginning. Now when you try to solve a catch-22, you've got to be very brave. You've got to push it up to a critical mass where it starts to create a market. And we believe that because the vehicles can be refueled quickly, because you can do it in a completely green way, and you can absorb surplus energy from the power grid, then you'll find that consumers pull through hydrogen vehicles quite quickly. In addition, there are some vehicle types which can only be done with hydrogen. Trucks, big buses, ferries, trains, all these things are under development because you cannot package batteries sufficiently well on those vehicles to offer a battery solution. You have to do it with hydrogen if you want a zero emission solution. So all these things are there, and I think it's important to focus effort on both the development of those technologies, but also the deployment of infrastructure in the form of hydrogen refueling stations in particular, and to be bolder. I think Mike mentioned Germany with 400 stations ambition by 2023. We don't have that boldness yet. There's a great open space to be bolder in this area. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I think it's obvious that hydrogen and electricity will both have, hydrogen and electric vehicles will both have a role to play. And electric vehicles have been in the news recently with politicians all across the world promising to ban diesel vehicles at ever increasing years. We're into the 2020s now. These people saying we're going to have no petrol or diesel vehicles perhaps in 15 years. And if we do go largely electric, that will put a big challenge on our electricity system. So I'm delighted we have Marcus Stewart from National Grid who can tell us about that, and just generally if you want to expand about decarbonising transport, you're very welcome to.
Thank you. So I'm Marcus Stewart and I head up our Energy Insights team within National Grid, and I sit in with our system operator, and we're responsible for managing the energy flows through Great Britain, both balancing the electricity network second by second, but also the gas network as well, and ensuring that energy gets transported to customers through our transmission networks. And I'll come from an electricity point of view first, but from an electricity point of view, we are technology agnostic. So if anybody wants to connect any sort of power system, power station to the grid, we have to offer them terms. So we don't have any bias towards electric vehicles, hydrogen, coal, solar, nuclear. We have to provide the same terms to everybody who wants to connect. So in my role, I have to look forward and say, well, what could be connecting? What does that look like? And what's the direction of travel? And we do that by engaging very widely with the energy industry, but also outside the energy industry, and we publish our thoughts each year. We publish a set of scenarios called the Future Energy Scenarios. They're available on the web, and we published our last set in July this year. And one of the big stories that we included this year was the rise of the electric vehicle and the potential impact that could have. And it's basically three reasons why we were bullish around the growth of electric vehicles. One was the main reason we've been looking at these for a long time was climate change and their ability to decarbonise transport. The growing and interest around emissions and air quality, which has really become a big focus over the last 12 months, particularly with the Volkswagen scandal, and actually post our publication a number of announcements from governments, both the UK government, the French government, but also the Chinese are thinking about banning petrol and diesels. India, a load of markets out there are looking at banning or restricting those types of vehicles, and also the motor manufacturers. We talked to a lot of those, and basically all the main manufacturers either have electric vehicles or plan to launch electric vehicles, either hybrid or pure electric vehicles, in the next 2 years as part of their lineup. So there's a weight of movement happening, and the third element that's driving that is the cost of batteries and the performance of batteries. Those have fallen at a rate that even the most optimistic projections have been forecasting have beaten. So we're seeing sort of these three things coming together and saying that actually we really expect electric vehicles to take off. But electric vehicles aren't the only answer, as one or two people have mentioned already. That for some sectors it's likely that other forms of fuel may be certainly efficient early steps. So sort of buses and trucks. In our scenarios, we identify a role for initially gas, compressed natural gas, maybe biogas, and then over the longer term, hydrogen, because of the energy density of those fuels compared to and the weight of the tanks compared to batteries. But it's just stepping back to batteries. One of the questions I do get asked is, if we get lots and lots of electric cars, can the grid cope? So I guess that's probably why I'm here. So just to give you sort of some insight into our projections. So in our highest case scenario, which is a scenario that is in line with meeting the 2050 carbon reduction targets that the government has, we're predicting that there would be around about 9 million electric vehicles by 2030. That would add around about 6% to electricity demand on an annual basis. And one of the reasons why it's such a reasonably small amount is because of the efficiency of electric vehicles compared to petrol or diesel. You can get basically, for the amount of energy you put in, you can go 4 times the distance in an electric vehicle because of the efficiency of the drivetrain. So 2030 is some time away. We need to invest as a country in our generation supplies to ensure that we've got sufficient renewable generation and low carbon generation to meet normal demand, and electric vehicles will be part of that. But the important thing around electric vehicles is when you charge, and that's when it has the biggest impact on the energy system. So we're big advocates of smart charging and time of use tariffs or routes to encourage smart charging. So I'll give you an example. So in our green scenario, where people are being smart around their charging, maybe incentivised, that 9 million vehicles will add around about 5% to peak demand. So, but if you didn't have smart charging, that could add around about 18% to smart demand. So there's a big impact. And when we tend to talk about smart charging, that tends to be people coming home at night, they've been at work, got home at 6 o'clock and plugged their car in, and just as particularly in the winter, that's what we call the tea time peak, when people are cooking their dinner, put the kettle on, Coronation Street, and some people are still at work, so that's the sort of the maximum stress on the whole electricity system. So if you could avoid that peak by just shifting it a couple of hours and charging overnight, or charging in the daytime when there's lots of solar energy around and it's lower carbon as well, those issues can be avoided. But not everybody can charge at home. So that is one of the shifts we're going to see. 43% of houses don't have access to off-street parking, so there's got to be other forms of charging as well. And we've published some work recently talking about the role of fast charging, so the forecourt charging that my colleague over there talked about, and we see that as part of the solution as well. And there may be other ways of looking at it, but to ensure that this potential rollout of electric vehicles happens, and we do decarbonise the transport sector. I think we need to look at how the charging infrastructure is rolled out. Standardisation of charging infrastructure as well. That seems to be key. There seems to be a sort of for those who remember, a VHS versus Betamax kind of battle going on between the different types of chargers. If we really want to create a low carbon transport system and opportunities for UK business and UK investment, then we should be standardising system. And the UK has an opportunity to become a world leader in this. We are, I've spoken to a number of companies over the last couple of weeks who are looking to sort of develop this kind of infrastructure and really come up with some quite innovative ideas. So, smart charging is essential. Fast charging and at workplace or at town centre, supermarket type charging is also a big part of the solution. And I guess my view is that it doesn't always have to be sort of funded centrally from government as well. I think there's opportunities for private organisations to be involved with speaking. I say we are speaking to people who are looking at this, and I think the point around direction of travel, consistency of regulation, and those elements will support that kind of take up without having to be I guess a burden on the taxpayer necessarily. So we're positive around the growth of electric vehicles. We're here to help. And we think it should be a collaboration between government, the transport sector and the energy sector, and there's a real opportunity there, and say as costs of batteries are coming down and other forms of energy efficiency are coming forward, I think the future's bright really. And just one last thing actually, sorry, just to say, electric vehicles are low carbon today as well. They are a lower emission today if you plug them into the grid today than a petrol and diesel engine. And as renewables are coming down, the cost of renewables are coming down, both solar and wind. We've seen recently, potentially a big reduction in wind power costs. The electricity system is going to get greener and greener, and that's going to be a great opportunity to, move, what I would call a sensible form of energy onto the electricity, because you can choose when you charge it, and therefore you can do it in an efficient way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. One other thing that came up in our report, and this is what got most publicity, was something that politicians should be aware of, and I'm sure they already are the imminent fiscal implications of a move towards electric vehicles, because we get over £30 billion in revenue from fuel duties and road taxes. And if we all go electric very quickly, I think Richard Howard calculated that could cost us over £10 billion a year in revenue. So by 2020, so the Department for Transport are working off revenues that are broadly straight. But if we stuck to the Committee on Climate Change's decarbonisation plans, we'd lose about £100 billion over the next decade or two, which is very, very important. Before I go to the audience, would any of the panelists like to respond to anything that another panelist said?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the charging point issue. I think the point you made about supermarkets is a very good one. So I don't know whether we need to be thinking through in terms of our planning processes, that when we're having developments that could be other shopping centres, whatever it may well be, that's integral to the permissions that are granted. But there's commercial opportunities there as well. Mm-hmm. It's not as if it's an obligation that's being foisted on people. It's a commercial opportunity. But the other thing, of course, we had the discussion in the Vehicle Technology and the Aviation Bill when these matters were being examined. One of the thoughts that was came through the process of an identifiable, readily identifiable charging system, because at the moment you've got several alternatives, and the interoperability is a key issue. But something that's going to be iconic. You had the telephone box, and we all treasure our red telephone boxes. we've got. I think we should perhaps have a national competition to come up with a design that's instantly identifiable for the charging points. But I just throw it out on whether anybody thinks it's a good idea or a bad idea.
Sure. Thanks. Okay.
Can I just pick up one thing you just said, Matt, which is about tax, really? And if we move to a different way of charging, road tax, vehicle tax, is that it does give us an opportunity to change the way that it's incentivised, because at the moment when you have a car and you pay something up front, then the marginal cost of using your car becomes very small. So so once you've paid for the cost of having your vehicle and taxing it and all the rest of it, then you kind of the incentive is to use your car at every opportunity. Whereas if you change it to where you use more, you pay more, you can change the choices that people have available about, well, I won't use my car every day of the week, or I'll use my car sometimes, but I'll use an alternative another time. So I think it opens up that possibility in a better way.
Yeah, I think lots of people are talking about road pricing, but it's politically difficult to say. We go to the audience. We want questions and not long statements. And could you state your name and organisation and wait for the microphone? I can see Doug Parr from Greenpeace there, so I'll give him the first.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Doug Parr from Greenpeace. A quick comment to pick up on something that Lilian said, and then a question for the panel. So, firstly, we should see emissions from diesel vehicles coming down thanks to the introduction of the RDE, real driving emissions tests. But we did some work with emission analytics on some of the most congested parts of London roads, and actually their Vauxhall Insignia and VW Golf are well above the limits that they were supposed to be meeting, even though their supposed tests had said they were quite a lot better. So just please note that these real driving emissions tests are not quite as real as they ought to be. Yeah. So if you're going along the Marylebone Road in congested traffic, actually that's contributing very substantially to exceedances, even with the newest cars available. These were late 2017 cars. The sort of thing I would push on, there's been some tremendous stuff on the panel, so thanks very much for this. That the infrastructure point about moving to electric vehicles, or indeed to hydrogen for the heavier stuff, is something that government needs to take a role in. And it seems to me there are two things that are missing from the sort of vision that Andy laid out about taking advantage of the industrial opportunity. One is that by international standards now, the current government's target for zero-emission vehicles in 2040 is a little bit passé. It's not strong enough, it's not quick enough if we're going to make the most of it. And the second point is that I would say their government is being a bit too relaxed about the sort of processes Marcus Stewart was laying out, about getting that charging infrastructure in place with the collaborative thing that only government can really do with a proper convening power. And could you sort of fill out how Labour might look at those two issues in terms of taking advantage of the opportunity and delivering on the promises?
Well, we had the legislation get quite far, right, and then we had the election, which kind of screwed everything up. But
well, yeah, what we did, we got all the way down the track with VTAB, and of course it was pulled. And the only things we've gone back to have been the air travel operator's licence, which is totally and utterly anodyne and non-contentious, and air flight, the space flight bill. This isn't helpful. These are the real issues. There was much more important elements within the bill that you've alluded to about how we tackle these issues of migrating to EV much more quickly than we should, and how we go about it. And sadly, that opportunity's been lost. And I think we do have to return to it. I do take the challenge on board that we've got to have that greater acceleration, and it's something we've got to flesh out over the coming weeks and months. You're absolutely right, and I take it on board. Thank you.
Lilian, would you like to comment?
I think the point you've made the point already in terms of government not being on the front foot, not being ready, and potentially, obviously, that's something that the select committee will want to scrutinise and look at.
Anyone else like to comment on the politics and the policy?
Let me just make a point around e-mobility. So I've been in New Energies now for around 10 years. And I've learned a lot of things, but two things really pop out that I've learned. First one is that implementing any change takes a while and is pretty difficult, and it doesn't matter whether that's an internal sell within a company or an external sell with stakeholders. And the second thing is, if you put enough bright people in a room, you can talk yourself out of any good idea in about 30 minutes flat. So I'm looking forward to us talking ourselves out of some good ideas. So the point is, with a fact that I found about e-mobility, and let's not forget we are doing e-mobility at Shell, but one fact is 76,000 Teslas made. If we increase that to 500,000 Teslas, that would take 60% of the world's annual lithium production. Now Ford, one car manufacturer, made 6.6 million cars last year. So that means that an awful lot of electric cars are going to take an awful lot of lithium, which means that's one constraint that potentially you bash into. Now there are grid issues, there are acceptance issues in terms of planning, and I'll open that up to the tomatoes coming my way of saying actually that's not true. And that's part of the debate about talking yourself into or out of good ideas. But there are so many different factors in all of this. This is why the collaboration bit is really, really important, because you need to get all of the right relevant facts on the table and actually find the right solution for the right city at the right time. And that might vary actually across the United Kingdom. So what's right for somewhere like Manchester may be different to somewhere like Dundee or London. So it's quite a complex thing to get right. So that's just...
Yeah, okay, I'd like to go back to the audience. The gentleman at the back there, Ralph. Yes.
Sorry about that. Could I congratulate you on your
Thank you very much.
until I got to page 46, obviously, where
Yeah, we got carried away.
where we've mentioned Uber. You know, if they cleaned up their act, maybe they would still be running around London. But let's leave that out.
Sure.
Could I just challenge, and it is a challenge to Professor Marcus, rather than Ronnie Evans, United Union, Road Transport Commercial. What we seem to forget here, and you said something before which concerns me. We haven't got a battery big enough to do the job of in heavy goods vehicles and what have you. Yet when you look at now the diesel emissions actually on a site of any retailer on the fridge vehicles, now the only thing they've improved is by making it intermittent start and stop, but it's still diesel emissions. The only good thing about it is for the companies, because it's red diesel, duty free. So we always seem to lose our contact with those people that are doing the job.
We have a question
and
or a statement.
in this case, and I don't think this is a statement, I think this is a fact, and it's a challenge, that why don't we start at the beginning of the runway rather than halfway down? I mean, if we would have started where, you know, in distribution centres and say, well, okay, if you were to look down at any distribution centre, you'd see the fumes coming up 24/7. That would have been, I believe, the place to start. Because one thing my wife wouldn't have is a diesel fridge. And I'm not being pedantic here, and I'm just making statements that we seem to start somewhere, you know, halfway down the runway.
Okay.
And it's about time we realise that people are driving these vehicles, and now there is proof that we do have cancer related illnesses coming from diesel, and yet we haven't even taken that into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that governments tend to rely on OEMs, car manufacturers, to start this process. But actually, you're right. If you focus on heavy vehicles, then you can take the emissions of those vehicles down to zero, because you can package enough hydrogen on board, enough fuel cell on board to have fuel cell trucks. So Nikola Tesla, you know, we all know the Tesla word because of the car, but his first name Nikola, if you look up on the internet, it's an American company developing a fuel cell truck called Nikola with a K. And I guess you could say governments kind of missed the trick that you're alluding to, which is really put a focus on the heavier vehicle side of the equation and look at the number of UK manufacturers of such vehicles. We've got one or two making buses, for example. And there's plenty of scope for further heavy vehicle development which could then do exactly what you're saying with or without the cars. So you know, you've got to turn some of that into action to develop the technology and then deployment on specific focus points that will take the emissions down. It'll fit together very well.
Okay. I've just been told that Andy is a very busy man. He has to leave quite soon. So would you like to make any final remarks before we let you?
It was just on. I mean, Lilian alluded to it earlier on the change to buses. We made the proposition that we should have conversion from Euro 5, Euro 6 buses, and that would bring about reductions very rapidly. I don't know whether the colleagues would agree with me that is something that we could have immediate dividends from, and of course so many of those vehicles are concentrated in those areas of major concern, and surely if we followed through on those sorts of programs, we would reap those dividends on a rapid basis. But I just throw that out there as a contribution. Hope that understood feedback.
All right. Well,
okay.
Thank you very much. Give a round of
Very
All right, so I'll maybe take two quick questions in a row because we've only got about 10 minutes left. Ralph, there's two gentlemen at the back there, and then I'll come to you afterwards. Yes, two. We'll take two questions in a row, quick questions there.
Peter Miller from Ipswich. By my calculation, there are about 15 million cars parked on the road each night that are not in garaging on private property. I have a feeling those owners who move to an electric car are going to be expecting an electric charging point on the street outside their house for free. By my calculations, that's £34 billion to provide it at £1,000 a site. I don't think they're going to want to go somewhere else and recharge. Can we move to shared vehicles? We must have a look at that one in the round.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, I think especially the younger generation are moving to that. The car ownership among millennials is plummeting as they move towards car sharing, and well, used to be Uber, but that's gone off the way. But yes, I think you make a very good point. Marcus, should you want to come in?
In fact, autonomous vehicles and shared vehicles is something that we've looked at in sort of the energy impacts for us. For example, and if you were to look at our scenarios in our greenish scenario, you know, there's about 31 million vehicles on the road today. That drops to about 25 million because of the benefits of autonomous vehicles and shared vehicles, which again, you know, we think will reduce the overall emissions because you've got that efficiency happening there. So that's one option. But you know, the point you make is the point I was making, that there's a chunk of people who will not be able to charge at home. Now, you know, there are some local authorities looking at, you know, lampposts and, you know, will that work and things like that. And I think that, you know, there's some more work to be done in that area. But you know, you don't have a petrol station at home at the moment. And you know, if you've got the average journey time, journey distance per day is around 20 to 30 miles for any car. If you've got an electric vehicle with a 200-mile range, which is seen to be the sort of the tipping point for mass adoption, you know, you can work out that you don't need to charge it up every night. You know, you certainly don't need to charge it up from full every night. So I think there are options out there that you know, innovative people can provide, and it doesn't have to be you know, out of the public purse to do so. I think there's commercial opportunities out there.
I think also, just to add to that, I think you've got to ask yourself, why on earth would you want to do that? You know, because you could go to a petrol station and fill your vehicle up with hydrogen in 3 minutes and drive off. You don't actually need to deploy charging points everywhere. So when I was arguing for being inclusive on the EV word, there are BEV, battery electric vehicles, where you need those charging points, and there are FCEV, fuel cell electric vehicles, where you just need hydrogen, and your normal mode of operation will be to go to a petrol station near the town, fill it up and drive away. Both are green, both are zero emissions. So you need to consider both and consider where you spend your money, really.
Yeah. So I said I was going to take two questions. I forgot to.
Hi, Chris Pratt from Hill & Knowlton. And thank you to the panel for a really interesting discussion. It's clearly a very complex change and systemic change that needs to happen over the next several decades. But I wanted to know what the panel think about how the government can be more inclusive with the consumer, and starting with the consumer and how people use their vehicles, how they might need to use their vehicles in the future. Because it seems to me, particularly with some of the systemic changes we've seen in the energy market already, we've started at the policy, we've tried to make the right policy, but we haven't necessarily considered the end user always, and how they need to use their cars, how they need to get around. So how can we make sure that this policy making is more inclusive and thinks about the consumers and what their needs are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and I kind of look round this room, and it's not to be critical, but it isn't as diverse, I mean, even as Labour Party delegates go. So I do worry that this conversation isn't happening with the wider population. And that was what I was saying in some ways about leadership, which is that the government do need to promote a wider public discussion about the sort of society we want to live in, what the choices are that are available to us, and how we're going to get there. And much as it's delightful to see all you, there are a whole load of people out there who are not even thinking about these issues, and how we can make sure it's inclusive of everybody, particularly that, you know, people from different income brackets, people living in different areas, you know, what's going to work for cities and urban areas, what's going to work for for smaller areas, what's going to work for rural areas. And I think, you know, sometimes these things get missed. So there's a really important role in trying to sort of have those discussions, and, you know, I think it's been reflected in our discussions on the panel that it isn't just about saying every vehicle, you know, we want to make it, you know, emission free. It is also about the choices that we make about when do we go on public transport, when do we walk, when do we cycle, not just about the vehicles that we drive. And that becomes even more a possibility if we have autonomous vehicles. I don't know quite how fast we're going to get to that stage. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about it, but I certainly know that if we have a rise of autonomous vehicles, surely that doesn't mean we all have to have one sitting at home that we jump into and it drives us to work. I mean, that would be crazy. So I think it opens up many more possibilities, but there does need to be a public debate.
Sure. I think I'll take two. We're running out of time, so two final questions. There's one at the front here, the gentleman, and you've had one, and the lady at the front as well.
Christopher Snelling from the Freight Transport Association. I just wanted to challenge a couple of things that have been said on HGVs, and sometimes the way we talk about this makes it sound as if they're staying the same. And in fact, the testing cycles for heavy vehicles versus light vehicles are completely different, and the heavy vehicle cycle has been a complete success. So you look at the HGVs since 2014, we're actually seeing on-road reductions of 80% in NOx. It's that scale of change. It's not a marginal thing. And that hits up against something Lilian was saying of a sort of an assumption that an HGV is dirtier than a car. And actually, if you look at on-road performance today, an HGV is cleaner than a diesel car, which is ridiculous when you think that they can be pulling 20, 30 tons instead of one. But it's also about the future of it, that from our members' point of view, what they're looking at is that it doesn't seem to us that the zero-emission heavy HGV is on the cards at the moment. We're going to need an interim stage between the cleanest diesel, which is Euro 6, we're not going to get any better than that, but we need an ultra-low emission HGV beyond that, and at the moment we have no definition of what that is. I think we agree with Marcus Stewart that it's going to be a form of gas, but what we need is a definition that the members of mine can actually start purchasing and investing in, because we don't know for certain what's going to be regulated on in the mid-2020s, so we can't make decisions at the moment.
Sure. We'd like to pass the microphone.
Yep. Okay. So Kate Hewitt from the Aviation Environment Federation. We're interested, I guess, in this debate primarily in the context of Heathrow expansion and whether or not that can be achieved within air quality legal limits. But I'm not going to ask about that. I was interested, Lilian, in some of the comments you made about demand management, and as part of this whole picture, alongside technology and infrastructure investment and all the rest, the fact that you see a role for demand management in the context of road transport, and if there's time, I'd be interested if you could say just a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Which is
maybe you covered it already in you made reference to kind of fiscal changes to how the way in which road vehicles are charged. Maybe that was the kind of thing that you were thinking about.
Well, I suppose what I was trying to say, I've been in transport long enough and heard people go road pricing, and then all politicians go, you don't want to touch that. And I think that's true. It is politically incredibly difficult, but I think maybe we should be at least having a discussion about the costs of jumping in our vehicles and what that means, and the fact that we can incentivise or disincentivise travelling by private vehicle, and maybe we need to reflect the cost of travelling in our vehicles a bit more realistically. And I think, you know, obviously there are some demand management things in place. We've got the congestion charge in London. Potentially there'll be charges that, you know, clean air zones can have a look at. That in Nottingham we've moved to a workplace parking levy as a way of kind of changing that balance and changing the discussion. But the revenues from that have been used to invest in better public transport so that it can change the choices that people make. And I suppose all I'm saying is that shouldn't that be something we're having a discussion about and not that frightened of? And because of the change in revenues, does that allow us to have that, does it provide an opportunity to at least have that discussion? Can I just pick up that issue about HGV? I mean, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that concern me about the clean air zones is that almost it kind of goes, HGVs and buses, it's all your, and taxis, it's all your problem. Don't worry about private cars. And I just think, you know, we need to look at the whole gamut of transport and think about what role each has to play.
Sure. We're just about done. Would any of the other panelists have very quick points that they would like to make, or are you happy to round it up there? Is there any burning issues that wasn't covered? No?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to remind you, I think we still have some hard copies of the report at the back if you'd like to take them away. If not, you can find the PDFs on our website. Thank you to the Labour Party for hosting us, and I'd like you all to thank the panellists for a great discussion. Thank you.